My name is Daniel Bennett. Most of you know me. It definitely is. If I look familiar to anybody who's new to campus, I've probably mentioned before, I am Barry Bennett's son. The reason we look so similar is because God, after He created my father, He said, "My masterpiece, I can't do better." And then the Holy Spirit looked at him, He's like, "Let's try one more time. We can do better." And so anyway, at least that's what I think happened. And I'm proud of all of you all for choosing a course called Wisdom and Maturity. I know some people might assume like, well, I'm not immature, I'm not stupid, I don't need a course like that. But that's not what this is about. And Proverbs 4 verse 7 says, wisdom is the principal thing, so in all you're getting, get understanding. First I'll introduce myself really quick for anybody who doesn't know me, and then I'll get into why I want to teach a course on this topic. So first of all, my parents, they met in Bible college. That's why I think it's not a bad thing to meet your spouse in a Bible college, as long as you don't just rush into things or get weird about it or throw wisdom out the window, wisdom. And so they met at a Bible college, and so I got to grow up in a home with two parents who are very, very passionate about living their lives for God. And so I got to benefit from that and to be surrounded by that. My whole life I was surrounded by ministers, by strong Christians, by missionaries, by pastors, and I really enjoyed it. When I was 4 or 5 years old, I got born again, and God's been my best friend ever since. Some people hate growing up in that kind of environment, but for me, I just really enjoyed it. And I'm sure I'll share some stories from that over the rest of this course. When I was 7 years old, my parents became missionaries. So we went to Guatemala first, and then we went to Chile. So I lived in Chile from about 8 years old to 18. And then I came back to the States. This was all a long time ago. I moved back to the States in 2000. And ever since, my heart's always been to live for God, to minister. I just didn't know how. I didn't know how to get from where I was to where my heart was telling me it wanted to be. And that's again, part of why I want to teach on this, because I have a lot of vision, a lot of passion. And so I was like, okay, how do I get from here to there? So over the years, I've done a lot of different things, missionary work and volunteering at different CARES campuses, did the military for a while. And I'll mention random stories from some of those over the course. So anyway, why did I want to teach a course called Wisdom and Maturity? And the simple answer to that is teach what you're good at. And I was like, if you guys don't laugh, you're not going to like any of the rest of this. Okay, so anyway, I was like, what could I teach better than any of the other instructors here? And so I was like, Wisdom and Maturity. No, I'm just joking. No. And so, but the real thing is, teach what you're passionate about, teach what you want to grow in even more. I'm very passionate about these topics, and I want to grow in them even more. And my background is a big part of why I am interested in this topic. Like I said, I grew up surrounded by strong Christians. I grew up surrounded by ministers. And one of my great disappointments in growing up was realizing not all adult Christians are strong Christians. I thought that was normal. I thought, how could you know God and not want to live for Him? How can you read the Bible and not want to do what they're doing? And so as I grew up, I started realizing, okay, why are some strong and some aren't? And so that was the first question in the syllabus, and then the next one, what is there for strong Christians? Most ministry assumes that we're failing. And I've talked about this before, but when we come to Christ, we're in desperate need. We need solutions to our problems. We come to Him with sickness, with disease, with poverty, with a poor self-image, with guilt, with condemnation, all these things. Okay, but is that all there is to God? Is He only freedom from bad things, or is there anything else? Is there anything beyond that? Because it seemed like, everybody would talk about wanting to become strong, but no one talked about actually being strong. So what happens when I'm free? What is there then? What's next? Most ministry is about getting victory. And I used to call this, I know I'm more tactful now, but I used to call this internally loser Christianity, where everything's just assuming that we're losers. Just everything is failure. You show up to church on Sunday, and I don't see this in my circles now, but I saw this a lot in my life in the past. There's this assumption that, oh, it's Sunday, you made it. You made it. Okay, now let's worship and pour out our hearts to God about all of our failures and all of our problems and get just enough encouragement to last another week. And there's that cycle of failure, temporary relief. Failure, temporary relief. And I was like, what happens if you're not in that cycle, though? It's easy to go forward when you're surrounded by darkness. You see the light. And so there's an obvious destination. But what do you do when you're surrounded by light? What do you do when you're not walking in failure? Because if you can't visualize walking in victory, you'll never actually get there. And so it doesn't mean that this course is only for people who are already in victory, but if we can't get a vision for what it's like to live victoriously, then how will we know what to do, how to get there? And so again, it makes it easier. Instead of saying, all I want is freedom, okay, what do I really, really want? You know, when I was growing up in high school, I was at this youth event, and they had this gigantic candle in the middle, and everybody's sitting in a circle. And this is at the end of the event when everyone's very emotional. And so first they do an altar call. You know, if you want to get born again, come forward and light your candle. We all had our own candles, and the one in the middle was lit. So some people got up and went to the middle, and they lit their candle and sat back down. And they said, if you just have totally turned your back on God, if you're backslidden and you need to relight, you know, if you need to rededicate your life, come light your candle. Then almost everybody gets up and goes. And they're like, hey, if you just feel like you aren't doing enough, that you just aren't as focused as you can be or should be, come forward, light your candle. And next thing you know, I'm the only person there without a lit candle. Everybody went, because I was like, they just assume like everybody's failing at some point. And if you aren't failing, you're just in pride, right? There's that assumption. Of course you're failing. Of course you're miserable. Of course something in your life isn't going well. And I was like, I'm actually doing really well. Love God with all my whole, like, what happens if I have a good week and I show up to church and it's like, hey, I'm so excited. What is there for me? And it's like, oh, we got nothing for you, but come back next week. We're sure something will go bad. Something will go wrong, right? And so, you know, those are the typical answers. If somebody says, I'm doing really well, someone will say, just give it time. A storm's on its way. And I used to hear that, where it's kind of like, if you're not in a storm, you just haven't lived long enough. And I was like, well, how long do I have to live before I can say maybe you're wrong? You know, or another answer is, oh, if you aren't walking in failure, you should be working for God more. If you don't feel bad about the bad things in your life, you should feel bad that you aren't doing more good things, right? That condemnation, oh man, I feel this pressure and this guilt because I'm not doing more. Or they say you're in pride. So no matter what, if you say, hey, I'm in victory, no, you're not, right? And there's that assumption. And so I didn't like that because, again, I'm like, if Jesus said I can be like him, then I have to believe I can be like him. He didn't walk around in condemnation and failure nonstop. So what does that look like in our lives if we walk in that? You know, are our only options failure and temporary relief? Running from death is not the same thing as running toward life. You can be running from death and just be running in circles. That's what the world does. That's what a lot of believers do, is they're running and running and running and running from something they don't want, but they don't actually know what they're running toward. You know, freedom from bad things is a speck of dust compared to freedom to life in Christ. You know, I treated you all to some amazing drawings in your syllabus. And believe it or not, I did those myself, freehand, in MS Paint. And so anyway, imagine getting out of prison and someone gets out of prison and they just stand right next to the prison. And they just stay there and say, I'm free. Thank God I'm free. Look at where I came from. I'm so glad I'm free. And then they just stay there. And they just stay there and stay there. And then they're kind of like, I'm kind of bored. You know what? I kind of had a routine before, and so maybe I'm just going to step inside to hang out with my friends here. You know what? That chain I miss that chain. I think I'm just going to slap it back on. And the next thing, oh, I'm in bondage again. And see, that's a cycle a lot of people have, is they get free, they don't know what to do with that freedom, so they fall back into bondage. You know, if you look at the second picture, again, I'm really proud of this one. I admit I did do it twice because I couldn't remember what the continents looked like. I got Canada way wrong. But again, true freedom isn't being out of prison. True freedom is forgetting you were ever a prisoner. True freedom is where you see the whole world for what it is and you say, okay, God, what do we want to do today? Instead of saying, I'm defined by where I came from. You know, you can use your past to bless other people, but don't limit yourself to that. If you came from an addiction or some kind of bondage and you're free, don't say, this is the only way I can minister to anybody else. Just say, no, the sky's the limit. Christ, the creator of the universe, is inside of me. I can minister to people in any way that he and I want to. And so again, you can use those things, but don't limit yourself to those things. Philippians 3:13, second half, Paul says, but one thing I do, forgetting those things which are behind and reaching forward to the things which are ahead. We can forget where we came from and it not be pride because we're focused on where we're going and where we actually are in the Spirit right now. Again, we don't want prison or our background, our past to define us because it's for freedom he set us free. He didn't set us free just so we could constantly stare at the prison and say, thank you, thank you, thank you. He wants us to move on. He's got this whole amazing world for us. 1 Corinthians 13:11. Paul says, when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. Again, it's leaving things behind that we came from and growing up and seeing ourselves differently, seeing different things differently. It's important to be free from the bad things. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be at all focused on those things, but you need a good defense and a good offense. What if you're playing soccer or football, if you're not from the U.S., and you block a goal from the devil, and you give him the ball back, and he kicks it again, and you catch it, and you give him the ball back. And you're like, I don't know what to do once I have it, so I'll just give it back to him, right? You need a good offense and a good defense. You need both. See, if you are the one scoring goals, if you're the one walking in victory, the devil doesn't have the ball. So again, if you have a strong offense, that takes the pressure off of your defense. So we need to be protected and to resist the devil. But we need to do it a whole lot less if he's the one who's trying to resist and defend himself against us. And if we have that mindset change of, no, I'm the one who's walking victory, I'm the one who's scoring goals, I know what to do with the ball. I don't just sit around waiting for someone else to kick it and I try to stop them. So here's the thing, it's easy to say all of this. Probably most of us have thought these things or said these things or heard someone say these things before. But a lot of Christians see victory as past tense. It's easy to point the finger at other denominations who say, well, back in the day of the apostles, look at what they could do. Or we don't need miracles anymore because we have the Bible, but wow, look at what it used to be like. Or even in our circles where we're like, wow, the revival of or early 1900s. And we think of, oh wow, if only I could have been back there. And we see that past tense success. So usually in our circles, at least, I don't see that very much. But we have the other side of that, which is everything's future tense. Where we always picture victory as something that we're not there yet, someday. We say, someday I can get that, or this is the year that this is going to happen. Okay, why not? This is the day that this is going to happen. Or so many times, again, I'm not considered youth anymore. I'm over it. But people always say the youth are going to change the world. The youth are going to do this. The youth are going to do that. And the minute you hit 25 or 30, whatever, then it's kind of like, well, whatever. Now it's the other youth. Okay, well, when is the youth from last generation going to do what was prophesied over them? Why do we keep pushing this off so that we never actually experience it? We never hold ourselves accountable. Did we walk in the victory we said we would? Did we walk in the victory God put in our hearts? Where we always say this generation's going to do this or next generation's going to do that, and we keep pushing it off, delaying it. Or even saying things like, man, I can't wait. Someday I want to get to a level where I can do this and do that. I'm going to walk on water, have my shadow heal people. I'm going to cast mountains into the ocean. Someday I'm going to do all that. Again, everything's future tense, but how do we actually get there? I don't like to be all talk. If not today, when? I'm an idea person. I love to think of all kinds of crazy things that could be done. But I love the ideas so much I want to see them happen for real. I'm also a strategy person. I took a strengths test, and my top two were ideation and strategy because I love both. I love, okay, what's the best idea and how do we actually do it? Right here, right now, with what's in my hand today, how can I get from here to there? How can I actually live this right here, right now? What's the very first step? What's the next step? What's the one after that? And that's where wisdom and maturity come in. That's how we get there. So very quickly, I want to do a course overview of what we're going to be talking about. You hear something like wisdom. Technically, everything you learn at Charis is wisdom. But I want to be talking about kind of the core principles that apply across the board. And even then, I won't be able to cover every single thing that's relevant. But the first 2 hours are kind of foundational. What's wisdom? What's maturity? Why are they important? How do we grow in them? On Thursday, the next 2 hours, next two lessons, we're going to talk about the big picture and the little picture. And then after that, we're going to talk about knowing what to do. When you think of somebody who's wise, you think this is somebody who knows what to do. If I need advice, I can go to them, right? Or they never get concerned. They always know what to do. And so there's two sides of that. Again, there's defense and offense. You've got problem solving. Okay, here's a problem, but a wise person would know what to do. But then it's not just about responding to negative things. It's also about being proactive. And so we're going to talk about problem solving and then creativity and innovation. How do you implement a new idea? How do you come up with things that aren't responding to negative things? And then finally, we're going to talk about living it. The whole point of being wise and mature is to make an impact in this world, in our own lives and the lives around us. And so we want to be unshakable and unstoppable. And so those are the last two that we're going to talk about. Now, I'm going to be focusing on the spiritual side of things, But this applies across the board. I have a list right here. This applies to your relationship with God. It applies to ministry. It applies to your career or business. It applies to parenting and marriage. It applies to friendships, to hobbies, to things you do for fun. It even applies to art and adventure, all kinds of things. So I'll be using examples from all kinds of different topics, but and also be going over kind of how do you use an example from one area and learn how to apply it to another area. Because again, it's all interconnected. If you have wisdom, if you have a heart of understanding, you can apply the same principle at its core from your job to your marriage. It's the same principles translate. So anyway, what wisdom isn't. I always like to start with what something isn't to kind of get rid of any assumptions. First of all, wisdom isn't automatic. It's not automatic with age. And I should have said that earlier with me teaching this course. If I didn't believe this, I wouldn't be teaching this course. Wisdom is not automatic with age. If you're older, you've had more time to work on it, but whether or not you chose to work on it is a different story. When I was a kid, people used to always tell me, or maybe not always tell me, but I'd hear sometimes, oh, wow, you're so mature for your age. Oh, wow, you're so wise for your age. And it got me thinking, I'm pretty awesome. Just kidding. No, it got me thinking, okay, first of all, that means that there's an assumed level of maturity for different ages, right? But then I also started thinking, this is a very temporary compliment. I got concerned because I was like, oh, I like the compliment. But what happens when suddenly my age and maturity are lined up? Like, oh, you caught up. Your age finally caught up. And I was like, I don't want to catch up. I don't want my wisdom to catch up with my age. When you were 12, you were very wise for your age. Now that you're in your 30s, you're normal. I don't want that. It's like when I'm 50, I want to be wise for my age. If I'm 100, I want to be wise for my age. If I live to be 1,000, imagine back in the day with Enoch and Adam and Eve and all them. If I live to be 1,000, I want to be wise for my age. And what would that even look like? I want to be mature for my age because I don't want to be limited to that. I don't want it to be like, it's kind of like with reading where someone says, my child reads at a 3rd grade level. And you stop saying that after a while. It's like, they're 25. Stop telling people, my child reads at a high school level. Yeah, well, they did graduate high school. People stop saying that, but there's kind of a limit. Eventually you get to a level where it's like you read at a good rate and it kind of just balances out. There's strong readers and weaker readers. But I was like, I don't want it to be like that with wisdom, where it's like, oh yeah, once you hit 30, everybody is equally wise. That's just not the case. And I don't want to wait until I'm 80 to teach on something like this. Old wise men start out as young wise men. Old wise women start out as young wise women. We don't have to wait and say, oh, someday I'll be wise. We can start wherever we're at. Again, with what's in my hand right now, what can I do to move forward? So, 2 Samuel 16:23. This verse really jumped out at me once. I'll have to explain how it's connected, but it says the advice, this is during David's, Absalom's rebellion, when he rebelled against King David. But it said, now the advice of Ahithophel, which she gave in those days, was as if one had inquired at the oracle of God. So is all the advice of Ahithophel, both with David and with Absalom. And I was like, that is really cool. For the Bible itself to say this person's advice was so good, it's as if they'd asked God. That's pretty awesome. And I was kind of like, I want that. I want to be like that. I want to think so much like God where I don't even know, is this prophetic or is this me? I don't know. I'm pretty cool though. I can't tell the difference. Why do I have to make the distinction? Because God and I are one, right? And so I want to be like, this is me and God. We both came up with this. And I don't know. I don't say, well, my ideas are stupid and God's are amazing. I want to say, no, I'm over here. God and I have wisdom. And if I have a dumb idea, that's just my flesh. Okay, so next one. Wisdom is not common sense. Common sense isn't actually common. What common sense is when a group of people all have a similar background or experience with something, and so they know the same information. And so sometimes, we don't realize that that's what's going on when we're surrounded by people with a similar experience. If you went to all your friends went to the same kind of school you went to growing up, you have a similar background, you can assume you know the same types of things. If everybody that you know watches the same movies as you can make inside jokes about different movies, or you can make references. You can quote a movie and everybody laughs. And then somebody shows up who's never watched that movie and they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so, I was about to do an impression, but I'm being filmed. So. Anyway, so you can have a common culture with a lot of different things. The same movie, the same language. same music, same food, the country you grew up in or live in currently, the kinds of parents that you had. If you have that in common with somebody else, you can relate to them, and then you see somebody else who has a totally different upbringing and they don't understand your jokes or what you refer to. Hobbies, with your education, these are all things that if you have in common with somebody, you can assume that you know the same stuff, but that's not wisdom. So you can look at somebody and be like, wow, they're not very smart because they don't, I had a buddy in high school and I mentioned that John Lennon was in the Beatles and he's like, what? No way. He was not in the Beatles. And I was like, how do you not know this? But he knew everything about modern music and he just didn't happen to know this. And so you can think to yourself, as I thought to myself, wow, you're really dumb. But it's not true. It just means they have a different background than you. I mean, the same guy, though, he was a good friend, but we got into an argument once because he said that tuna fish isn't a real fish. That's just what they call dolphin meat. And I was like, no, there's a real thing called a tuna fish. And he's like, no, there's not. And I'm like, you're stupid. He's like, you're stupid. And we went back and forth. We were in high school. I've matured since then. But anyway, finally I found out what happened is that his tuna fish can had a Dolphin Safe logo on it. So it had a little dolphin on it. And he didn't read Spanish. and so I was like, so you saw the dolphin picture and thought that this is dolphin meat. And so anyway, when I finally proved him wrong, he was like, whatever, I don't care. So I have very mature conversations. But that was 20 years ago or something. So yeah. So anyway, if you hang out with people who have a different culture than you, you might feel like you don't fit in, but that doesn't mean you're stupid or you're not wise. That just means you have a different background than they do. And that's the story of my life. I keep going to places where I'm the odd person out. I go to different countries or different cultures, whatever. And so everyone's laughing and you're just kind of like, ha 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 ha. Yeah, nice. Okay, so so one last thing on that point is that it doesn't mean that you're not wise if you don't have this in common, but if you look at it on the flip side, it means if you hang out with wise people, you'll start to have more in common with them. The way that the wise people think will start to become normal to you. And so if you want to be wise, one of the things to do is hang out with wise people. If you want to be passionate about something, hang out with people who are passionate about that thing. If you want to be effective, if you want to be successful, hang out with people who are those things, or at least who want the same things. So next point, excuse me, wisdom isn't complexity. Some people think that the wiser you get, the smarter you get, the more complicated your brain gets. Everything's more and more confusing, more and more complex. It's actually the opposite. Wisdom simplifies. It's complicated to the person who doesn't understand. The person who does understand is like, that's actually very simple. And so we don't have to run away and say, I can't handle complexity. Don't worry then, because the goal is for it to not be complicated. The goal is for it to be more and more simple. The next one, wisdom isn't good intentions. This is a mistake that I made a lot over the years, is because I assumed my motives are pure, I want the right thing, and so if I have the right motives, whatever decision I make is a good decision. And because of that, I made a lot of messes. You can do that where you're like, I'm trying to do the right thing, but I'm not. And I'm going to go more in depth on this in a future lesson. But wanting the right thing can be very short-sighted. And without going into too much depth, well, could you all pull up Romans 10, verse 2? Where it says, that some people have zeal, but they don't have knowledge also. You can be very passionate, want the right thing, and yet if you don't have knowledge, you can cause a lot of harm. And the reason that it works this way, and again, I'll go over this more later, is that you can say, I care, and I'm going to make the best choice I can right now. But if you really cared, you wouldn't just limit yourself to that moment. You would back up and say, okay, how can I give myself better options? How can I prevent that situation from even coming up? I'll go over that more in a future lesson. So next point, wisdom isn't the opposite of faith. This is one I used to hear a lot. I still hear every now and then. One person says, I've got faith. And someone else says, yeah, but you need to have wisdom too. And they talk about it kind of like they're opposites. If you have one, you can't have the other, and you have to find the right balance. Well, right now I'm operating in faith, not wisdom. And right now I'm operating in wisdom, not faith. And we're doing ourselves a disservice if we think that way. Someone says faith is trusting God. Wisdom's being prepared in case God doesn't help, or in case God doesn't come through. Right? And that's how we approach it sometimes. Like, I need both. I need the wisdom. I need worldly wisdom and faith, because sometimes faith doesn't work and I need a backup plan. And so if we think that that's what wisdom is, then we're missing out on true wisdom. The wisest thing you can do is trust God. Wisdom and faith are not opposites. They complement each other. It is complete foolishness to not trust God if He's spoken something to you. But the most faith-filled thing you can do is lean on his understanding, to lean on his wisdom. You know, a lot of people hear God say jump, and then they jump off a cliff. And they say, well, God said jump. And they say, okay, but did you say how high? Did he say when to jump, where to jump? Again, so it's like King David. When he got anointed to be king, you know, Samuel anoints him, he's out with the sheep. What happens next? He went right back to the sheep. What if David had said, he just anointed me, and he just marched up to Saul and said, I'm the new king, step aside? That would not be wisdom, and yet that's sometimes how we handle it when God puts something in our heart. You know, you're like, I think God put on my heart to marry this person. I should go tell them. I don't even know them, and I'm going to tell them right now and tell them that they don't love God if they don't marry, you know, if they don't want to date me immediately. You know, or, oh, God called me to this. I'm going to sell everything and go right away. It's like, okay, did God say when? You know, again, you can have that conversation. Okay, how high do you want me to jump? We don't want to use our natural foolishness. But again, there's a difference between that and having God's wisdom. We want to trust God completely. That is wisdom. But wisdom is also saying, tell me how to do it, not just what to do. I want to do it in your strength, not in my strength. So again, if we think that they're opposites, we'll throw wisdom out the window when we think we're walking in faith. And then we'll throw faith out the window when we think we're walking in wisdom. But they go together. They go hand in hand, and they complement each other. Next point. Wisdom is more than knowing how to apply knowledge. You know, there's a common saying, a common definition is that knowledge is when you know something, wisdom is when you know how to apply it. And that's not a bad definition, but it's limited. I'll go into that more in a little bit, but I'm going to move on. And then the last point in this section is wisdom isn't understanding. There's overlap, but they're not the same thing. And so that brings me to the next major point, which is understanding. We can't talk about wisdom without talking about understanding. So first of all, understanding versus knowledge. What's the difference? Like I mentioned, understanding and wisdom, they simplify. See, knowledge becomes more and more. The more knowledge you have, the more things that you have in your brain. You know, facts and trivia and things like that. You have insight. You may have learned a principle that somebody taught you, and so you have all these principles, filed away in your mind. So information becomes more and more. It can become like a giant ball of Christmas lights, all tangled up. But the thing is, only knowledge by itself, if you're good at it, it can lead to being puffed up. You can be proud, like, oh wow, I understand all this really well, because you have all that knowledge. If it's too much for you, it can lead to being overwhelmed. But understanding is different. Understanding is much more powerful than knowledge. We need knowledge, but understanding is even more powerful. With understanding, everything becomes less and less. You know, think about math. It's hard to memorize it when it's just memorizing, but the minute it makes sense to you, you're like, well, now I don't have to memorize it, now I understand it. 2 plus 2, I don't have to remember, like, what'd they tell me 2 plus 2 was again? I can solve that problem in my head, I think. Think of driving. You don't have to memorize every single action that you take. Okay, right now I have to shift this like this, and ease on the foot and do this and do that. You don't have to remember the knowledge because you understand how to do it. Think of speaking a language or reading. Again, you go through that initial phase where it's like, oh, this is overwhelming, this is difficult, I have to learn all these things. You're like, oh wait, I understand now. Now it's simple. And so our goal is to understand. We don't have to memorize answers if we can solve the problems as they appear. If I'm driving home, and this is a bad example because I am bad with directions, but if I'm driving home and all of a sudden there's a road blocked off, I don't have to be like, what do? I guess I'm stuck. I'll wait till they're done with construction. I can solve that problem. I didn't know this. No one's ever told me about this problem before. I didn't get taught how to do this. I just knew, okay, if I go over here and then go over there, I'll get lost, and then I'll call my wife and she'll tell me what to do. No. But I can solve the problem in the moment. I didn't have to learn in advance. And so, benefits of understanding. One of the major benefits of understanding is it makes things simple. It makes life simple. Like I was just talking about, because you don't have to remember as many things. When you come into a situation, you don't have to say, what did they teach me at Charis that I should do right now? I learned so many random things. Which one do I apply right now? If you understand, you can say, oh, I know how to solve this, how to approach the situation. The next thing, you can do things intentionally. And I could do a full lesson on this, but very quickly, if you can use something without understanding it, you can use a cell phone without knowing how it works. Right? But somebody knows how it works, right? No one actually understands how the whole thing works, but people know their different areas. You can do things without understanding them, but if you do understand them, you can do them faster, you can do them better, and you can be more effective with them. Imagine a world where you're the only person who knows how to read, and no one else knows how to read, and everybody comes to you and say, please read us this, please read us this. And you read for them, you're providing for them, right? If you don't understand how to read, if you don't understand why you can read, you just know how. You're like, I don't know how to teach it. I can do it, I just don't know how to teach it. Everyone has to stay dependent on you forever. And again, sometimes that's how ministry is, where it's like, okay, this person can read the Bible and get revelation. No one else can. We all get confused, so we have to go to this person and go to this person. And they don't know how they get revelation. They can't explain it, so they can only give us what they get. It's very limiting. But see, if we have understanding, if it's like, no, I know why I'm a strong Christian, therefore I can teach it. I can do it faster, I can do it better. Think of technology. Because people understand how something works, they can make it better. Each generation gets better and better and better. Think of exercise. People these days can look way different than like 100 years ago. No one could look like bodybuilders look like today because they understand this food helps these muscles, these steroids help this, this exercise does this, because before people could work out all day, but they didn't fully understand what was happening. So they could be like, well, I want to be ripped, so I'm going to go running for 2 hours. Okay, well, that's not the way to get ripped. You also need to lift weights, right? And so you could do things that are counterproductive where you're like, well, of course it makes sense. I'm working out. Okay, there's different kinds of working out. See, if you understand it, you can be more effective with it. You can be better, faster. This works with everything. If you don't understand what creates a good marriage, you might stumble into one by accident, and you might stumble back out of it by accident. You don't understand what caused success, what caused failure. But if we understand, we can do it better, faster, and more effective. The next one is we can teach them. Like I was mentioning, if you're great at something but you don't understand why you're great at it, it dies with you. You could be the best evangelist, the best prophet, the best pastor in the world. If you don't know why you're good at it, then when you're gone, the people after you are going to be like, well, based on what he did, we can kind of guess that this and that or how he did it. But if you understand why, you can pass it on and the next generation can go farther. You might say, I know how to be prosperous, and you might think you know how to teach it, but if you only partly understand your success, everyone else is going to have different results than you. So again, and like I mentioned, you can solve problems that you've never seen before. When something comes up in life and you're like, I'm not prepared for this. I've never heard of this situation before. You can say, okay, well, I'm going to back up and just look at the situation. I have understanding. I used to always think about, why do some people read the Bible and get confused? And some people, like Greg and my dad and Andrew, they read the Bible and get amazing revelation. What's the difference? It's a different heart. It's different understanding. They're filtering the Bible through their understanding, their foundation, their knowledge, their relationship with God. And so the more we understand, the more we can build on that. So next point, what is understanding? At its simplest, at its core, understanding is about cause and effect. It's all about cause and effect. If I do this, this will happen. That's understanding. I understand that pushing this button will cause that light to turn on. And it's really fun to watch this with my daughter, for example, where it's like she does something. She's learning so fast. It's amazing. And, it's like she does something, we laugh. Guess what? She's going to do that again. And then we laugh. And she does it again. We laugh. And so that's why you have to be really careful where if she does something bad, slaps me, or, then we laugh. It's like, no, don't do that again. Straight face. So I have to say no. And so then you teach her, if I do this, they say no. If I do this, they laugh. Okay, I'll do this one. It's all about cause and effect. And so, we learn that more and more. This causes this, that causes that. But then our understanding goes deeper. It's kind of like, for those of you who've ever played chess, where it's like, if I move here, I moved there. Okay, you're not very good at chess, but that is a legal move. But as you get better at it, you realize if I go here, they're probably going to do this. And if they do that, I'll probably do that. And you start looking a few moves in advance. Same with anything else where you say, I'm hungry. I want to eat a sandwich. Okay, I'm going to go make a sandwich. And then I eat my sandwich, and then all of a sudden my wife says, did you eat all of Olivia's food? And I'm like, what? Oh, oops, I didn't look ahead. So again, understanding is saying, I'm not just looking at cause and effect. Because see, that's the short-sighted side of it is, I want this, so I'm going to get this. But then when you look at the bigger picture, you see, I want this, so how can I get it? And you start looking ahead. What are the side effects of doing this? So like with dating, say, I want to date this person. I'm going to walk up and tell them they have to marry me. Okay, you're like, that's looking at one step. This could possibly lead to me marrying this person. Okay, but it's very short-sighted because deep understanding is saying, if I do this, what will actually happen? And based on what I think might happen, then what will happen? And then what will happen? And then what will happen? So we start looking at the bigger picture. I'm going to go into this more in depth in a future lesson. Basically, how many levels can we see ahead? Because we don't want to just see the cause and effect, because it's very easy. You see a lot of this of, I was angry, so I yelled at them, and I felt better. Ta-da, I felt better. That was my goal. I wanted to feel better. Okay, what's the bigger picture? Tomorrow you're going to feel way worse. And so again, it's can you look ahead to see what's going to happen down the road? Again, cause and effect, multiple levels of that. And again, the problem-solving course will be a lot about this, or the lesson on that. So another way to understand understanding is counsel. Counsel, advice is when you're helping somebody else see cause and effect. It's the same thing. So someone says, this is what I want. And they say, well, okay, here's different ways you can do that. Because you're saying, here's the effect that I want. So they're saying, here's different causes that can lead to that effect. Or on the opposite, they say, this is what I want to do. And they say, well, these are different side effects you may not be aware of that will happen if you do that. And so counsel is helping somebody else see cause and effect. If you combine the two, it's very powerful because someone can say, this is what I want to do. And you say, okay, well, that could actually lead to these side effects. But if you do this other thing, you can still get the thing you wanted. You say, I want an apple. Okay, you could say, well, steal an apple, you get the apple. Right, and obviously this is a very obvious example. Okay, but if you steal the apple, here's some side effects. You're going to get arrested. You're going to get in trouble. You're going to get kicked out of school. All these things are going to happen. Say another way to get an apple is to buy an apple. And if you do that, then you get to eat the apple. You get to be happy. And again, these are very simple examples, but they can apply to very huge things. If you can see the bigger picture. So counselors help see different causes and effects. You see, and I'll go into these examples later, but Joseph and Daniel were great examples of this, where they said, here's what's going on, but let me paint a picture of what this means. Joseph with Pharaoh, he didn't just say, Pharaoh, it's going to be 7 good years and then 7 bad years. Bye. He said, okay, here's what this means, though. It means that we need to start preparing right now, because that way when the bad years come, we can solve that problem. So again, I'm just kind of laying the foundation, but Proverbs 11:14 says, where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in the multitude of counselors, there is safety. Again, you might say, I know exactly what's going to happen if I make this decision, but someone else might say, you might not notice, but this other thing's going to happen too. Do you still want that? Is there a better way to get what I want without getting the things that I don't want? So next point, dangers of understanding without wisdom. Understanding isn't wisdom. Like I said, understanding is a tool. It can equip wisdom, but it can also equip foolishness. It can make goodness more effective, but it can also make evil more effective. And that's why I don't like the definition of wisdom is about how to apply knowledge, because you can be very effective at applying knowledge for bad reasons. There's a lot of examples of having understanding without having wisdom. Growing up, we've all probably experienced this, like as teenagers, we've all gone through this at some point. And if someone's raised them, I'm sure that you see it on the other end. It's easy to see this in teenagers and ourselves, because we're like, I'm starting to see cause and effect. I'm starting to understand more what's going on, but I'm not seeing the bigger picture yet. And it's not limited to teenagers, unfortunately. Some people never outgrow this, actually. But when we understand how something works, but we don't have the wisdom along with it, it can lead to a lot of negative things. One of them is tearing things down. If you understand something, but you don't have wisdom, it can lead to cynicism. It can lead to mockery or criticism or complaining, because you can see what's wrong, but you can't see how to solve it. And so you start to get frustrated because you're like, this isn't the way it should be. You said this, but you're not doing that. I see a discrepancy right here. Or I see this and I see that. And without the context of the bigger picture, it can lead to frustration, which then turns into cynicism, mockery, criticism, complaining, things like that. It's kind of like saying, this isn't perfect. And to prove that I noticed it's not perfect, I'm going to destroy it. Because see, without the wisdom of saying, how can I help make this better? How can I build this? How can I improve this? Again, that's wisdom, is to see the bigger picture. Another thing it can turn into is manipulation. If you understand how something works, but you don't have the right heart or the right vision, you can use that to try and manipulate people or manipulate different things. Relationships, whether it's romantic or work or with authority figures or family or friends. You can understand, I've heard people say this. I mean, it's sickening when you hear somebody talk about how they're manipulating somebody else in a relationship. If I say this, if I say that, I know that I'll get them to lower their guard. If I do this, if I present this and that, you hear all these techniques and it's like, that's disgusting. That's understanding how to make something work, and yet there's no wisdom behind it. So it's empowering the wrong direction. It can also lead to, under manipulation, it can lead to lying and cheating. Basically, different forms of trying to cut corners. You understand enough to try to get what you want as quick as possible without looking at the ramifications, at the bigger picture of what other people wanted or what you wanted in the long run. Another thing understanding without wisdom can lead to is pride. 1 Corinthians 8 verse 1 says that knowledge puffs up. If you have a lot of understanding without wisdom, you can just get very proud about it. Another thing that you can fall into with understanding is depression. A lot of times people who are depressed have a level of understanding, and yet they're not seeing the bigger picture. There's wisdom that's lacking. Because if you're depressed, many times you're more aware of problems than of solutions. And so you're like, I understand the problem, but I don't see hope. I mean, honestly, if someone's not a believer, I don't know why they aren't depressed. It's just distraction, I think. Because without God, there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And so, to me, in the natural, it's very normal for somebody to be depressed because it's like, yeah, you're very aware of your situation. It's not a good situation. It is pointless in your current state. Desires look impossible and trying looks pointless because you say cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect. No matter what I do, I won't get what I want. And so understanding can lead to depression if you start seeing it through that filter without wisdom, without seeing God's heart or the big picture. It can also lead to, or part of depression is it can lead to comparing ourselves to others. On the one hand, somebody can say, everybody but me is succeeding, and so I'm depressed. Or you can look at the other side and say, everybody but me is deceived. They should be depressed. I'm the only one who sees things the way they really are. Everyone else should be depressed too. And so again, these are just negative things that understanding can be twisted into without wisdom. So wisdom. Wisdom is more than understanding. Wisdom's knowing what you should want in a specific situation based on what you really want in the big picture. And see what that means is, in a situation, you can say, what do I want? But then if you back up and look at the big picture, you say, what should I want? And the way you do that is to say, what do I want more than anything? You see, when we get tunnel vision on a specific situation, we can say, here's my 3 options. What do I want? And well, that one looks best to me. And you choose that one. But if you zoom back, you say, well, actually, none of these are what I want. Or maybe it was a different one is what I actually wanted because this one leads to short-term benefits. I wanted the long-term benefits. And so, again, it's not about saying you should want this, feel condemned if you don't want this. It's about zooming back and saying, what do you really, really want? What do you actually want? Because if we zoom back, almost every believer is like, I want God's best. And yet we make so many decisions that are less than God's best because we have tunnel vision on a specific set of options. If we zoom back and we say, okay, what is God's best? What does that actually mean? What does that actually look like? Then that will inform the small decision. So the next point is understanding equips wisdom. You can have understanding without wisdom, but you can't have wisdom without understanding. If you're the wisest person in the world, but you have no understanding, it's like, having great armor but no sword. You're very limited. You can't do anything. You have the right focus, but you can't do anything with it. But the more understanding that you have, the more effective your wisdom is. Because if you have understanding and wisdom, your understanding equips your wisdom. So now you want the right thing, and now you know how to get it also. You go into, let me talk a little bit more about what you really want. Because I feel like many times we get, again, like I said, we get tunnel vision on something. We get incredibly focused on this is the situation that I'm in, God, what do I do? And we don't realize, okay, if I approach things a little differently. So one example that I thought of from my own personal life is over the last couple months, I've been falling asleep on the couch by accident almost every night. And I always tell my wife the next day, I'm like, I don't know why. I fall asleep for like 2 hours, then I wake up in the middle of the night, and then I go to bed. And I'm like, I don't know why I keep doing that. I don't want to. I keep saying I won't do it. But for some reason, I keep doing this. And so I realized okay, when I fall asleep, I didn't choose to fall asleep. Something out of my control happened, right? So if you zoom back, you look at the bigger picture and you say, when did I make the last conscious decision? When was I thinking straight? Because I'm like, I didn't mean to fall asleep, it just happened. And when that moment happened, there's so many things going on that I saw my options as, these are the two options I saw. Get up and be miserable and unhappy that I got up, or stay right here, incredibly comfortable, and just fall asleep, and this pillow feels so great. Those are my two options, right? Where I'm like, this is amazing, and this one's terrible. But see, the next day, I wake up and I'm like, I keep doing this. I fall asleep, I wake up, then I go back to sleep. I don't get good rest because I'm just sleeping 2-3 times a night instead of just once for a long time. And so see, the next day I'm kind of like, my options are sleep well all through the night on a comfortable bed, or don't fall asleep on the couch like an idiot. I'm a grown man. Why am I falling asleep on the couch? And so, see, in the moment, my options are be comfortable, don't be comfortable. But if I zoom back, I say, no, my real options should be, when did I make that decision? So again, I'll go into this more in the problem-solving one. So you have to back up. When was the last moment I was lucid? Where I was actually thinking straight? Okay, that's the moment that I needed to make a decision. See, I never decided at 10 or 11, whenever I fell asleep, this is when I want to fall asleep. The mistake I made was at 9 o'clock when I lay down on the couch and I pull out my phone and start watching videos or reading something. That was when I made a decision. And right then is when I'm kind of like, I'll be fine. It won't happen tonight. I know it happened the last 2 months every single night, but it won't happen tonight. And so that was when I had to change my approach. Because again, what do I really want? I want to sleep well. I want to wake up refreshed. And so based on that, what should I want in the moment? And so again, sometimes it's not about solving the problem once you're in the worst part of the problem. It's about backing up and saying, how do I solve the problem before it becomes a problem? So you have to look at the timeline and say, here's a sequence of events. This is where I fell asleep. I wish I hadn't, but right then and there, everything inside of me said that was the best decision to make. That was exactly what I wanted. Okay, but what should I want? Okay, if I truly care, if I truly am open to correction, self-correction, I need to look at earlier in the timeline and say, I shouldn't have sat on the couch in the first place. I should have just sat on the computer because I have an uncomfortable computer chair, so I won't sleep there. Then I'll go to bed at the right time. And if you truly care, you back up and look at the bigger picture. And so very quickly, we're going to be going over all of this more in future lessons. But it's very powerful to want the right thing and then to know how to get it. What should we want and what can we do about it? And so that's what this course is going to be about. This next lesson, I'm going to be talking about how to mature and how to grow in that side of things. So anyway, thank you all very much.